So
we do have, I can see that there are 2 people waiting to be admitted.
Yeah, can you admit them? I'm sorry. The double tasking is hardcore.
You can't see it. I know. I know.
So you have the co-host feature as well, so you can add people in. Okay. All right, we are now live officially. It's kind of like broadcasting or something, the way this works. And today we are having our virtual book talk with Dr. Brad Agnew and Dr. Kelly Agnew. Dr. Brad Agnew is no stranger to Northeastern State University and the History Department. He is a legend in many ways as a long-term faculty who taught many years at NSU. And you see my husband's, he's in the audience too. He's listening and taking notes for the Telequad Daily Press. So we are writing an article for this as well. And Dr. Agnew has focused a lot on local histories, especially Oklahoma histories, has various publications. So I strongly recommend people, I know a number of my students have already worked with his pieces, has played a major role in the history of Northeastern State University, especially at its centennial history. And so this is a project that got him a little out of his comfort zone, or maybe not. He found a lot of different directions, and we'll hear from him about that. And then Dr. Kelly Agnew is, by relation, Dr. Brad Agnew's daughter, who is a biologist at University of California in Berkeley, UC Berkeley. And so it is an opportunity to connect Oklahoma to California here via Zoom and be Facebook Live on our NSU History Department and have this resource. And Dr. Kelly Agnew teaches genetics and works with over, you had mentioned about 700 students. You work with many students and got involved with this project with your connections at the herbarium you had mentioned as well. So I won't take too much time introducing them because we want to hear about this, your new book that came out, unfortunately, right at the beginning as the pandemic and outbreaks of COVID-19 really hit in 2020. But it's never too late to pick up this book about John Gill Lemmon, a botanist, and we're excited to learn about the book, encourage people to go. It's available on Amazon, available in different places to read it. And what's exciting as well for the History Department is to hear about the process of how this research was done, how the book came together as an inspiration for students, especially with this interdisciplinary collaboration, as I mentioned in our previous exchanges before, of a biologist and a historian working on this history of John Gill Lemmon. And why John Gill Lemmon? Why write a book about him and his life and work? So we look forward to this conversation. I'll turn the time over to Dr. Brad Agnew and Dr. Kelly Agnew of how they want to co-host this conversation and direct it. But we do want to leave time open. And we'll make sure, just as a reminder, this is a live Zoom meeting, so some Zoom protocol reminders I forgot to mention is if you are not speaking, be sure you are on mute. We'll try to watch out for that. And if you don't want the camera on, you can turn that off if you're not presenting, but I will try to watch the chat so we can have enough time, maybe 10 minutes at least at the end, to open up to questions people have. I also will watch the Facebook Live if we might have questions come in that way, where people can comment on the live streaming of the book talk. So now, without further ado, I turn the time over to Drs. Agnew, Brad and Kelly. Thank you for joining us, and thank you for your work and sharing with us.
Since Kelly really discovered John Gill Lemmon, I think she should begin by telling how she encountered him.
Okay, I'm happy to do it. And thank you, Farina, for having me. I'm joining you from Berkeley. I'm going to see if I can share my screen really quick. And let's see here. Share. All righty, let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, hopefully you all can see a picture of Berkeley. that look like, okay. So just to let you know where I am, I'm talking to you today from near Berkeley, California. We are in the East Bay, the San Francisco Bay. You can see there, that's the Golden Gate Bridge, and that big tower there is our bell tower. And some of those buildings in the background on the lower right, that's where the herbarium actually is. And that's how I got started on this, because as Dr. King said, I am a biologist. And I was working at the herbarium, gosh, I think it was the mid 2000s. And the herbarium is just a place where we store plant specimens. And this is what an herbarium looks like. And for any of you that have been in any kind of archives, this should look familiar. They're these big compactors that slide on tracks. But inside those big cases, what we have are plant specimens. And so they look like that. And they are basically plants that have been collected out in the field, and then they've been pressed in a plant press and then dried and attached to pieces of paper, and hopefully some good historical collection information is attached along with them. And we store them in these big cabinets, and we have, just like for regular library archives, they have to be protected from insects. They have to be fumigated with all sorts of nasty gases to keep the bugs out. Otherwise, you can lose an entire collection. And so this is when you open these things up, they're arranged by scientific name and family, and then you can pull out the folders and you see things that look like that, and that person is holding a plant specimen. And at UC we have 2.2 million specimens. We're the third largest herbarium in the country. And we used to say we were the largest west of the Mississippi, but that's not really true because the Missouri Botanical Garden is bigger than we are. But we're the largest public university herbarium in the world. So we have lots of specimens. And this is what they look like. And they're important to science for a lot of reasons, because for us, some of these specimens can be hundreds of years old, and they're collected all over the world. And we can go back and look in these places 100 years in the future, and we can see who was collecting and where these plants were found then. And we can also, now we can get DNA out of them. So that's really important to know. You know, as with modern technology, we can figure out how these things are changing genetically, how climate change is affecting where plants are found, all those sorts of things. So that's what the specimens look like. And this happens to be a specimen that was collected by John Lemmon. The way I stumbled on this is sort of one of those stories that you hear about like in the movies, where, so my very first day of work at the herbarium, our head curator was walking me around the herbarium, showing me all the different things, and showed me where all the plants were kept and the computers and all that stuff. And then there was this closet out sort of in this area that was underneath a drainage pipe. And he opened up the closet and he said, "This is where we keep the field journals." And there was this big tarp, like a visqueen tarp, over this pile of books that were in cases, like, you know, the boxes that cases of beer come in, like Corona. There were all of these old journals. It's like an archivist's worst nightmare. And they were under this tarp. And one of them was this thing. And he said, "This isn't really a field journal where the collecting botanists would write down their collections. This is this thing from an early California botanist. He was also in the American Civil War." The curator happened to be British, and so he always referred to it as the American Civil War. And you know, Brad's my father, and he's an American historian, and of course my ears immediately went up, and I was just, I need to see what this thing is. And so I went back that very same day, and I was sort of rooting around and looking at it, and I was just shocked that it was in a beer box. And I opened it up, and I'm sorry, this is a horrible picture, but this is what it looked like. On the inside, it was this old scrawly pen and ink writing, and it had a picture of this man, and it was his journal of his recollections of being a prisoner of war in Andersonville prisoner of war camp and in Florence later, while he was in the Union cavalry. And he describes hospitals and battles, and you know, my eyes were just popping out of my head. And this is what he looked like early in the war. I turned the page, and this is hard to read, but what this is, at the top, it says Kilpatrick's Circuit of Atlanta. So Lemmon was part of the campaign. You know, I didn't know who Kilpatrick was. I'm not a historian. You know, I'd seen Gone with the Wind, and I heard about Sherman marching to the sea and all that. But this was part of the cavalry campaign's approach to Atlanta. And Lemmon was part of that campaign, and he had this map that he had detailed. And then a couple pages in was a map of Andersonville prison, or as he called it, Camp Sumter. That was the Southern name for it. And I was freaking out by this point. I didn't care about the plants. I was just, holy cow, this is fascinating. So I get home that night and I call my dad and I say, you are not going to believe what I found in the herbarium. And so I'll let me see if I can stop this share really quick. So hopefully you can see me now. You know, so I called Dad on the phone and I said, there's this journal, and so I went back the next day and I was taking pictures and I was sending him to him on email saying, this is crazy, there's this guy, and I didn't even know who Lemmon was, but he was in the American Civil War, and he has a prison diary from a prisoner of war camp, the most notorious prisoner of war camp in the South during the Civil War. So that's how it got started.
And I might say I was totally uninterested. I was extremely busy doing something else, another project. I am essentially a local historian, and who cares about some cavalryman from Michigan? I didn't care about it, but for eventually my project wound up. It was the history of the centennial history of Northeastern, and I was really busy on that. And when I got through, first of all, Kelly never stopped harping on me to really get involved, and kept sending me things. And finally I thought, well, I'll placate her. And I got to looking at the Lemmon collection, and what that book is a series of newspaper articles that he published immediately after the Civil War, most of which were completely forgotten. I think almost all of the places he published, the newspapers went belly up long before the end of the 19th century. And I'd never heard of Lemmon. I did a literature search. I couldn't find anything about Lemmon anywhere, nowhere at all. And I was convinced that he was totally unknown. And as I read the newspaper articles, he was a good writer, and they were rich in color, all kind of things that never make it into textbooks. And so I just, well, I can get a couple of articles on the Civil War out of this. And Civil War is an interest of mine. And I got started. At one point, I have to say, we were probably a year into the project, and in all this research that I'd done, I had never found any mention of Lemmon at all. But I was looking at David Evans, Sherman's Horsemen, an account of the cavalry campaign, Union cavalry campaign on Atlanta. And there was Lemmon. I was shaken to the core, because I thought Lemmon is mine entirely. And I raced to the end notes, not even a reference. I got to the neck. He was mentioned 6 times in the index, and I eventually found that this information was coming from a diary that I suspected existed, but had no idea where it was. And eventually I found out that it was in the Huntington in San Marino, California. And so far as I know, he is the only person that ever touched that diary. And it actually wasn't a diary. It was a memoir written in 1866. Kelly was much closer than I, so she went and got it. You want to talk about getting the memoir?
Yeah, sure. And so, when Dad first told me about this, I thought, oh, well, that's the book we have here. That must be the book we have here. But it wasn't. This was a different account. And this was an account of earlier in the war when Lemmon was still moving from Michigan down through the South. And he joined his unit in Ohio, and then he crossed the Ohio River, and then he was in Tennessee for a while. And it talked about his time in the hospitals in Memphis. And was it Nashville? Yeah, he was in Tennessee. And I said, well, that's not what I have at all. So I went down to Pasadena and went to the Huntington, which is amazing. I mean, they've got the Gutenberg Bible, and they've got all of these European medieval texts. And of course, you have to go in with gloves, and they check your bags for everything. And it was great fun, because this is not the sort of thing I normally do. Sure enough, they had this small leather-bound book with this old scrawly writing in it that was really hard to read, but it had maps of the encampments on the banks of the Ohio River, and it described the troop movements as they were pressing further south, and the engagements they had, and what it was like in the city. And the city had just been turned over from Confederate control to Union control. And so again, I'm sitting there snapping pictures and sending them to my parents in Oklahoma from California. And we think that the Huntington got it from one of the former directors of the herbarium here. What he must have done is break the cardinal rule, and he took that journal to his house and had it at his house. And when that director died, they cleared out his house and sold the books wholesale. Probably in the 1940s, early in World War II, probably. And they sold that stuff, and the Huntington bought it. And that's how they got it.
But as far as I know, that's the only thing that really has been published about his Civil War experiences. And I was relieved, to say the least, because I thought, my gosh, somebody's already done this. Very early in my research, I did a presentation for, I think it was Kiwanis Club, about the little bit that I knew about Lemmon at the time, and that was strictly Civil War. I highlighted two of his initial skirmishes in the action resulting in the capture of Atlanta. What I'd like to do is I'd like to show you that I actually took the skirmishes out and left what is basically just sort of an introduction to Lemmon, who he is and where he came from and where he went. Let me see if I can share the screen now and get this on.
Oh, we'll rally round the flag, boys, we'll rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom. And we'll rally from the hillside, we'll gather from the plain, shouting the battle cry of freedom. The Union forever, hurrah, boys, hurrah! Down with the traitor and up with the star. While we rally round the flag, boys, we rally once again, shouting the battle cry of freedom.
After the publication of scores of books, little new can be added to the understanding of the combat that resulted in the capture of Atlanta in 1864. But a private soldier left a graphic account of the action which provides a perspective different from the broad overviews sketched in most of those books. Time doesn't permit the retelling of all of his Civil War experiences, but this presentation will provide a summary of his life and concentrate on the first two engagements he fought in the advance on Atlanta. John Gill Lemmon was a 30-year-old country school teacher in southeastern Michigan when the 4th Michigan Cavalry Regiment was mustered into federal service in August of 1862. After brief training, which involved little more than parade ground close-order drill, the regiment boarded trains in Detroit and steamed south to confront the forces of rebel General Braxton Bragg, who had invaded Kentucky. Before the regiment joined the action, Bragg had ordered a withdrawal. Skirmishes with a rear guard commanded by Confederate Colonel John Hunt Morgan produced few casualties, but the Michigan regiment was decimated by disease. Childhood illnesses and a host of other maladies claimed more lives and put more men out of action than enemy bullets and artillery fire. By late October, Private Lemmon had developed a racking cough, chest pains, and a perpetual headache. Constant movement and exposure to the elements worsened his condition, and he was soon confined to the regimental hospital where care and food were in short supply. By this time, with half the men in the regiment unfit for duty, medical personnel were unable to cope with the magnitude of illness. Lemmon decided his chances of survival were better out of the hospital. Still seriously ill, he followed his regiment to Nashville. Union medical officials realized that Lemmon was in no condition to rejoin his unit and assigned him to hospital duty in the recently liberated capital of rebel Tennessee. Although his health gradually returned, he remained in Nashville for more than a year, determined to provide better medical assistance for the wounded and sick than he'd received. After more than a year of detached duty, Lemmon persuaded military officials to return him to his regiment, which he rejoined in late April of 1864, just as it made final preparations to break camp at Columbia, Tennessee, and march east to Georgia to support General William Tecumseh Sherman's advance on Atlanta. For the next 3 months, Lemmon was in constant action as the Union advanced on Atlanta. During the final days of the siege of the city, the Michigan private participated in a daring cavalry raid commanded by Union General Judson Kilpatrick, who led his command completely around the city, destroying rail lines. Greatly outnumbered and encircled by the rebels on several occasions, the Union force cut its way out of traps by bold saber charges against overwhelming odds. Ironically, a few days after reaching the safety of Union lines, Lemmon was captured by Confederate irregulars while he was securing fodder for his horse. He soon found himself in the notorious rebel prison compound at Andersonville, Georgia, where he remained for several weeks before being transferred to the equally brutal but less well-known POW compound at Florence, South Carolina. In late February of 1865, as Sherman's army marched through South Carolina, Confederate guards abandoned their post at Florence, and Lemmon and his fellow POWs were liberated. One of the few men able to walk out of the prison, Lemmon weighed little over 90 pounds. After a brief leave, he tried to rejoin his unit, but Army officials realized that he was in no condition for active military service. He was discharged as the war came to an end. Lemmon returned to his home in Michigan, but most of his family had moved to California following the discovery of gold there. When his physical condition didn't improve, the Michigan veteran sailed from New York for Panama, crossed the Isthmus, and booked passage on another ship for California. Reunited with his family in the high Sierras near Nevada, his health gradually improved, although he never recovered fully from the impact of prolonged malnutrition and the conditions he endured during his captivity. Fascinated by the new plants he encountered in the high elevation of his new home, Lemmon's interest in botany was rekindled. He devoted the rest of his life to the study of the flora of California and the American West. Many of the plants of that region now bear his name. He died in 1908 at the age of 76. Until recently, his extensive writings about his wartime experiences have been neglected in the archives of the herbarium of the University of California, Berkeley, by scientists more interested in his specimens and plant notes. Lemmon's accounts of his experiences in the war offer insight about medical treatment, the Atlanta campaign, and life in a Confederate prison camp from the viewpoint of an articulate private soldier.
Okay, let me get this back. Are we back properly now? I can't really tell for sure. Okay, let me sort of go back a little bit. At that time, I knew nothing about Lemmon's early years, so I couldn't comment at all. And after about a year and a half or so of work, I had decided that 2 articles just wouldn't do it, but a brief book of about 5 or 6, 7 chapters with an introductory chapter on Lemmon's early life, and then a concluding chapter that took care of everything from the end of the Civil War until his death would be absolutely sufficient. And so I began work, and I tell you, the next thing I did was the first chapter, which was a challenge. And I think I'm prouder of the first chapter because when you can build something out of nothing, it's difficult. There just wasn't much around, and I was certain that the last chapter would be the same way. I was stunned by the amount of information I found in his post-Civil War. Literally, the book grew exponentially. I decided to add 2 chapters, double that to 4, double that to 8, double that to 16. There are 16 chapters after the Civil War. The bulk of the book is there, and he turned out to be a fascinating person. Personally, I don't like John Gill Lemmon. I am maybe one of the, Kelly, I think you share the same opinion. I think we are probably some of the very few biographers who did not fall in love with their subject. John Gill Lemmon is a person that's not really easy to it's very easy to dislike him. And he probably inherited a family trait. His parents moved, well, they were born in the Finger Lakes region of New York, an area of New York called the burned over region, because it was a hotbed of religious fervor during the Second Great Awakening. The Mormons, just a lot of groups came from there, as well as abolitionism, prohibition. They're all rooted in that area. And his family was imbued with sort of a Calvinistic ethic. As the father was related to William Cromwell, and many of the boys in the family bear that name. By the time they got around to Lemmon, and Lemmon was late in the family, they'd used up all the names, and therefore he was named after an English theologian, a Baptist minister named John Gill, who was a determined Calvinist. And the Lemmons had a very Calvinistic orientation. One of the stories that I really loved about early after their arrival, before John was born, in Michigan Territory. They migrated about the time the Erie Canal was finished, and they arrived, and they needed a house for this large family, and the community pitched in. And this was an era where they consumed about probably 4 or 5 times as much alcohol per capita as we do today. And they'd worked 2 or 3 hours. They got the big timbers up for much of the structure, and it was time for a break. And it was traditional for the family that was being helped to provide some liquid refreshment. Well, the liquid refreshment that the Lemmons provided was water, which was totally unacceptable. And the men walked off and were literally came back only at the persuasion of one of the the pillars of the community who said, don't blame the kids for the fault of the parents. Well, Lemmon inherited that Calvinistic tendency. He was convinced that he was right, and if anybody disagreed, they were wrong. But not only wrong, they were morally deficient. And he sort of has that attitude throughout the Civil War, and throughout his life. One of the things that occurred to him and to me is that he was in the Army for almost 3 years. He entered as a private and he exited as a private. And he explained that if he had been more flexible, he probably would have ended up an officer, which is probably almost certainly the case. But Lemmon isn't very easy to like because of, Kelly, jump in and tell me, give us your opinion of him too.
Yeah, I think, what I got out of reading a lot of Lemmon stuff is that life was hard, and he was always, he didn't have two nickels to rub together ever. And, he was plagued by poor health. Today, we'd probably say he was diagnosed with PTSD because, he saw some stuff in the prison camps, no doubt. But he fought to get he had all sorts of trouble getting his pension. And about the smartest thing he did is he probably married a very strong woman. But he was always sort of badgering people for help. But I also sort of admire that because at the time Lemmon was, when he started his botanical work anyway, people who did science were the upper crust. They were the elite, Charles Darwin. They were aristocrats usually who were very well educated and were men of means, and they were almost all men. And Lemmon was out there in the back country of California, and he was finding plants, and he tried to send them down to San Francisco to the very young California Academy of Science, and they dismissed him because he wasn't of their class and their background. And so he said, okay, fine. And he turned around and he sent his specimens back east to Harvard, to the most famous American scientist of his day, Asa Gray, who was a friend of Darwin's. And you got to hand it to Lemmon. He was tenacious. He just didn't let that kind of class structure stop him at all. And he said, okay, I'm going to have this kind of blue blood Harvard dude look at my plants. And it turned out he had found some really interesting things that were unknown to Western science. So not likable, but inspirational in a way, I guess.
Actually, after he emerged from prison, he weighed less than 100 pounds. And it varies from 85 to 95 pounds, but he never fully recovered. And I agree with Kelly entirely. I think he suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder for the rest of his life. He literally could not work. He had been a school teacher and administrator before the war. And he could not do that. He was a farmer also before the war. He could not farm in California. He tried to peddle books. He could not do that. But he was intrigued by the strange flora out there that he'd never seen before. And that probably saved his life.
It probably did. It gave him something to do. And what does impress me is, he couldn't hold a day job, or he couldn't spend a day driving a team in his brother's hay fields, but he could schlep all over the Sierra Nevada, which are not mountains for sissies, right? These are some of the highest peaks in the country. And Carrie, here, I'll show you what I brought. This is a plant press. They're big and they're unwieldy, and he did not have a pack animal. He these things on his back, and they are fully loaded, and this weighs 20 pounds empty. And he was all over the Yosemite area. He was way up in the mountains north of the Tahoe area. And he collected plants till the cows came home through some of the worst winters. I mean, the Donner Party found out a couple years earlier that the winters there are no joke. And he would stay up in the mountains all winter long, collecting plants. I mean,
he collected them in the summer. He categorized them in the winter.
Yeah, it was nuts. Can I show you guys what some of those specimens looked like actually?
Go ahead.
Is that okay? So let's see if I can find it again. Oh, there it is. Share. Hopefully you can see this. So hopefully you can see this is what this is right here. This is one of the plants that he collected. And I'll zoom. What this thing is, this is clover. All right, trifolium. It's common clover. It's the stuff that farmers feed their livestock. And that's what his brothers actually had done. So the brothers came to California. They were 49ers, and they realized very quickly that they weren't going to make a fortune panning for gold, as most people didn't, but instead they started farming way up high in these Sierra valleys, growing hay to feed the mule and oxen teams that were servicing the mining camps, and they bred horses that were strong enough to pull the ore carts because the rail system hadn't been developed yet. And so this was probably the clover that grew in the meadow where his brothers had their cabin, and Lemmon stumbled out of his cabin and he found this clover. Let's see if I can get this to work. And this is a close-up of the label. And you can see down there, Trifolium is the genus name. That's what clovers are. And this is actually named for him. Now, it is very poor form to name a plant for yourself. That's just not done. You don't do that. But what he had done is he sent this back to Harvard, and two very prominent botanists who were at Harvard, Gray and later Watson, named this Lemmon's clover. This is Trifolium lemmonii. So this is a species that bears his name, and there are lots of these all over the Sierra Nevada. If you go up to Tuolumne Meadows in the summer, it's carpeted with this beautiful pink paintbrush flower. That's Lemmon's paintbrush. And there are a couple cool things about this. Now, and as a historian, first of all, Lemmon didn't do a great job documenting where his plants came from, because you can see here on this label, he says, Sierra Valley. Well, Sierra Valley is like 30 miles long and 5 miles wide. It covers 2 counties. I mean, that's not really terribly helpful, but that's how botanists did it back then. Like John Muir is famous for collecting these really pretty awful specimens, and he'd say, collected in Yosemite. You know, Yosemite's a big place. And it says it was collected in July, but he doesn't tell us what year. And you can see down at the bottom, Lemmon, because he was relatively well educated for a man of his time, he tries to use a lot of the Latin. He made these labels himself. He was definitely a self-promoter. And so lemmonii, technically in Latin, that should have 2 eyes on it. And down at the bottom, see where it says legit J.G. Lemmon. Legit is Latin for collected by. So that's great. But then you can also see his description is curious, 3 to 7 leaflets. Well, curious in Latin, curious means rare or unusual. And so he was trying to be Latin about it, but it's kind of not the way probably Asa Gray at Harvard would have done it. Up in the upper left-hand corner of the label, you can see LEG, that's for legume. It's in the bean family, the Leguminosaceae or the Fabaceae. And so you can see a lot of other people have gone through here. All of these other labels, these are scientists who came along later who confirmed that, yes, this is Lemmon's clover. And on that label at the top where it says probably an isotype, That's important. A type specimen is really important to scientists. This is what we call the voucher specimen. It's like a Platonic ideal almost. This is the reference specimen that we refer to when we want to know what is the clover look like. So an isotype is a copy of what's called the holotype. The holotype in Lemmon's case always got sent to Harvard because California Academy wouldn't have anything to do with him. And these specimens are incredibly valuable. The biggest type collections in the world have this horrible habit of getting destroyed. The largest collection in the world used to be in Berlin, but during World War II, it was completely bombed. And so all of those precious specimens are gone, they're lost to history. And so we have copies of the type. And this is one of those, oops, sorry. And then here's another specimen. This is a fern, obviously, that he collected. And again, you can sort of see, here it says Weber Lake, Sierra County. So at least we have a county, and that's helpful. And we know where Weber Lake is. That's north of the Tahoe region. And here you can see all of a sudden something has changed, right? It says collected by J.G. Lemmon and wife. And if you know anything about his wife, she was sort of a battle axe. She is the person who campaigned to have the California poppy be named as our state flower, which, you know, is everywhere. Like even my drink has California poppy on it. So she was a force unto herself, but she doesn't get credit here. She's the person also for whom Mount Lemmon outside Tucson, Arizona is named, because she was the first white woman to climb to the peak, but she doesn't get to use her own name. She's Sarah Lemmon, wife of John Lemmon. And what's interesting here is you can also see that Lemmon's made some notes to himself on the label at the top. It says compare to Mount Graham, Arizona territory. He was very interested in collecting in Arizona in the 1880s when the Chiricahua were really active, and Mount Graham was the northernmost limit of the Chiricahua's activities, and they ran into some scrapes in the Arizona territory in the 1880s. So that sort of gives you an idea of what happened after the war. He was a very active collector, and I'll stop the share now so that you can see what that looks like.
In 1873, when there was a momentous development in his life, Asa Gray from Harvard named the first plant that Kelly mentioned after him. And his description is rich. He left the house. Fortunately, there was no one around. He acted like a madman. He addressed the plants, the planet, everybody. It was a major event in his life, and probably ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in the botanical area. Let me say that Sarah is going to be the subject, his wife, of a biography. I've forgotten the woman's name. Do you recall, Kelly?
Wynn Brown.
Wynn Brown, right.
Yeah.
And it's going to be published by the University of Nebraska Press, probably within the next year or so. Actually, from 1880 or 1876 on, the Lemmon book essentially becomes a co-biography of Sarah, Plummer Lemmon, and John Lemmon. And Kelly is correct. She was a force to be contended with. It really was a match made in heaven, I think. They were very much alike. One of his early biographers suggested that he was less powerful than she, less motivated. And I think that is really right. She deserves much of the credit, and she faithfully promoted him constantly. We should also mention that he was constantly at odds with almost everyone. Mm-hmm. Asa Gray was frequently on his case because, as Kelly mentioned, he was pretty sloppy in his collecting techniques. But more than that, Gray just got beside himself because John wanted to name every plant after himself, his wife, or somebody in the family, or some close friend. And Gray would send these scathing letters, and Lemmon would apologize. And then the next letter he would be doing exactly the same thing. He just really never learned. And another thing concerning the California Academy of Sciences, they were increasingly interested in naming plants from the West themselves. And Lemmon remained attached to the Eastern establishment, to Harvard. And there was a battle royal. He and Edward Green, another great collector of that period, fought tooth and nail for years and years. It was just a bloodbath.
And it was really important because University of California, Berkeley didn't exist then. And it was a time when science was getting started in the West, and the West was this bold new place where we sort of left the East behind. And Lemmon in many ways was a man of his time, and in other ways, he just was always sort of a square peg in a round hole. And I see the note from Farina that we are close to time, so we probably need to wrap up.
Well, let's just open it to questions. I would be happy to respond to anybody and everybody.
Thank you so much. I'm just amazed by how well you two talk together about this. Like, teamwork here is incredible. I mean, it just seems so well rehearsed or something, but it's natural. And
no, it's because he raised me. I mean, the great thing about working with a family member is that I can call him up anytime and we can have very frank discussions.
That's awesome.
The other side of that is that you're also working with a family member, right? And as we all know in our families, you can have disagreements about things, and you have to sort of know when to give and take. And Dad's a historian. He's in your world. He writes like a historian. That is so foreign to the way I was trained. We always write in active voice, and we keep things concise, and we have to keep the page limit to 2 pages, and everything is very clinical. And it's just it's so different from the way I am trained. So, but it was fun. Yeah.
I love that as well. I think there's such a push for these kind of interdisciplinary collaborations and work, right? Because we get siloed into boxes of, yes, there's certain training and different aspects, but it isn't just, this is biology, this is history. Here's such a case of in a man's life. I mean, learning about him and the impacts that he had. And then also Sarah Plummer Lemmon. I'm excited that there's a biography about her, because that was a question I had of what was that relationship? And it sounded really deep there, especially this is Women's History Month too.
Yeah.
And the dynamics that you all refer to, in my interest, I'm very much focused on Native American and Indigenous histories. And then also I'm drawn to gender and women's studies too, and those histories. And then there's others, of course, at our university who are. So my ears really opened up when there was the reference to Chiricahua, to some of like the tensions of also the history of the American West, the issues of, new frontier history of even the terms we use, because for Indigenous peoples, they've known these plants all along, and then like the first, that kind of language, but then how it's renamed, like these names that are scientific names, and then this way of processing it, that's what interests me, is these transformations. But I am curious of, is there conversation with Indigenous studies in California about the understanding of these plants? And
there's a huge ethnobotany program here, and how the Lemmons approached botanizing in the Arizona territory in 1880 probably saved their life, because the Chiricahuas had lots of war parties going out in the 1880s, and Anglo settlers were getting attacked and their ranches were being attacked. And there's this kind of apocryphal story maybe that John and Sarah were out in the middle of nowhere, probably not too far from Fort Bowie, and they encountered a band of Chiricahua, and they were a war party, and they sort of said, "What are you doing?" And Sarah and John opened their plant presses and said, "We're collecting plants." And Sarah speculated that either the Apache thought that they were crazy or they had powerful medicine, because they were collecting these plants, and they left them alone. But that same day, a nearby ranch was raided and the Anglo ranchers were killed.
Actually, that is, I've heard that story too, and I looked like mad to try to find that. And I absolutely could not find that they actually were in contact with the Chiricahua. They were in the Rucker Valley in the Chiricahua Mountains. They were holed up for more than a week in a tunnel, and it was only the Chiricahua leader was Hu, J-U-H, and he went off the warpath and stayed off for quite a while. But that is a fantastic story, and I wish we could have put it in the book, but
yeah, it's apocryphal. We don't know, but yeah, it sort of has something for everyone, and I'd encourage your students to seriously think about these stories in science that, scientists don't normally pay attention to this stuff. That's why that journal was sitting in a beer box under a tarp, because we're interested in the plants. But there's a whole wealth of information out there for an aspiring historian of the West: history of science, history of the gold rush, Civil War history, the women's movement. She was instrumental in the Red Cross during the Philippine War. All of this.
She's into the Women's Congress in Los Angeles, and John was as supportive of her as she was of him, and she really promoted his career.
Yeah.
And thank you for mentioning that. I think what your response also brings up is, why could you include some things, why not? That there's stories, that you're trying to connect them to different kind of sources, and this process of what makes it in the book and what doesn't, all these things you do know, and these indications there, and then searching for it. I know right now my students, I'm having them practice with research, and they sometimes feel like it is so hard to find sources for what they want, and it feels like a scavenger hunt. And I tell them that's hands-on history right there. So that's
the best part, right?
I know, enjoy it, go on it. I want to be sure, do we have other questions to give time to other folks who are with us, who have been joining us today in our history department at NSU, if they have other questions?
I have a question. Hi, actually for Kelly, I'm curious about how the herbarium is used today compared to how it would have been used in the past. I mean, you seem to indicate that there's a lot of testing that it's used for, right? And I was looking at the way they were pressed, and I didn't know, were they originally for form as much, to identify?
Yeah, so it used to be, the first herbaria were in the Middle Ages, and they were physic gardens, right? Where they would say where plants had medicinal properties, and it was really important that you displayed, there's an art to it. I mean, it's as much an art as a science, where you show the flowers and what the seeds look like, and show it during different times of year. Make sure you show the root system, what can be used for what ailments. And that's pretty much the pattern that we kept until the molecular revolution of the 1950s. I mean, that's what we use these things for. But the collections are so much more valuable now. There's a big study going on where we're going back to these places in the Sierra Nevada right now, looking and seeing if the plants that John Lemmon collected in 1880 are still at that elevation, because with climate change, we expect them to keep moving up, right? Up in elevation. So it's really, these collections have a life that probably we haven't even thought of. 100 years from now, people will be going back and looking at these things.
Thanks. Great
Thank
question.
you.
Tell the story about the pitcher plant.
Oh, the pitcher plant. So you all know what pitcher plants are, these insectivorous plants. They have this kind of funnel where the insect crawls in and it sinks and it dies and the plant digests it. It's kind of like a horror movie kind of thing. And the plants that do that are usually found in the South. You can find them in Cherokee County, and where the soils are very, very poor and the plant can't get the materials it needs from the soil, so it eats bugs. And there is a place in California where we have something called a cobra lily, and it's a pitcher plant that has an arched head with a hood, and it looks for all the world like a snake. And it's got these two things, these leaves that come down that looks like a forked serpent's tongue. And John Lemmon had heard from these little lady collectors, because that was a thing for Victorian women, right? They made an art, and they made the most beautiful specimens too. They make these specimens and they'd show them. And he heard that there was an isolated population way the heck up in the Sierra, in this tiny little town that burned last year, like the rest of California. And he went up there and he found this tiny population. And Dad and I went up there a couple of years ago to try and find it. And we did find the cobra lily population. It is the only population of pitcher plants in Western North America of that species. And like how they got there, I mean, they just evolved in that place. They're not closely related to any other pitcher plant anywhere in the world.
One of Lemmon's critics maintained that he stole the credit of one of these female collectors, and it's not past the realm of possibility that was absolutely accurate.
He probably did. Women just didn't get the credit, and they were the best collectors, you know, because they had attention to detail. They knew how to, in the time, it used to be that instead of taping things on, you would sew the plant into the parchment, because now we use paper, but it used to be on vellum, on parchment, and they'd sew it in. And women were just better at it. So,
Wow, that is incredible, and just makes, you know, it inspires us to get outside to explore, like the story of how it even saves his life, as you say, in various ways, and then it reminds us as well of these contested spaces, that violence and the impact of violence, and then, you know, where plants and that connection of a human to the surroundings and to all life, you know, in nature is so powerful, and especially women's roles in that. I also want to point out in the chat, you have a shout out to Dr. Brad Agnew from Dr. Dennis Venchenko. I don't know if you want to reiterate that in person, Dennis, of saying how Dr. Agnew is such an inspiration. If you want to say it, Dennis, you can.
Oh yeah, hi Brad. Yes, I'm just amazed how productive you are. Yes, yeah, I remember you talked about this project a while ago, but you know,
10 years.
Yes, before retiring. Yeah, I remember, you know, you distinctly mentioned that several times. So it's been on your back burner for a while, but yeah, I'm glad you found the time to finish it. So it sounds like a great book, and definitely, you know, with your great writing skills, you know.
Yeah.
Is the one who really, you all know as historians how hard it is to read that scrawling writing and interpret what the heck is that letter, what is he saying? And she's the one who documented all of the letters, who organized all of the files, all of that. And we tried to make her an author on the book, and she just absolutely refused. So maybe she doesn't want to be associated.
That is absolutely correct. She did more work on the book than either one of us. I used to believe that I had the world's worst handwriting. Then I saw Asa Gray's, and I realized that I had an equal. Then I saw George Engelman, and my God, one of my favorite stories about Horace Greeley, who had a terrible handwriting, he was sick one day, and the people up in the editorial area got a chicken, ran it across the paper, and that's supposed to have been the best editorial Horace Greeley ever wrote. Well, some of the stuff that we translated,
That mom
I'm not
translated.
sure whether it's just our belief or it's actually on paper, but yeah, those botanists, those 19th century botanists, really were terrible. I should also, I'd like to mention the Weber Hotel. You know,
Quickly, Dad,
this
they're running out of time, so quick.
happened long ago, and Lemmon spent his several winters isolated all by himself, organizing his collection in the Weber Hotel, way up in the mountains, deeply snowed in. That hotel still exists, and Kelly and I were there 3 or 4 years ago. Somewhere around here, I still have a square nail I stole from the place.
The building's going to fall down now.
Oh, it's going to? I thought they were going to save it.
No, because you stole the nail. I'm teasing. They are going to save it. But
thank you so much for this conversation, and I'm glad that you also acknowledged Kelly's mother, your wife, Brad Agnew, Mrs. Agnew, or Doctor, or I'm not sure.
She's mom.
Okay, yeah, I mean, and that shows us, behind a book, when you write a book, it's a team effort. It takes so much contributions and kind of the unsung heroes, whether that's archivists or partners and colleagues. And I think that that's an inspiration as well. And
it
especially
is
something to acknowledge today. And I've learned so much, and I know our colleagues you have other folks thanking you in the chat for your time and for sharing these stories and insights. So it certainly has inspired me to read this book, certainly in anticipation as well of the ongoing works that these connect to in the literature and the conversation. And also the works at UC Berkeley with the herbarium and biology and botany. It's exciting to see all these connections.
So for any students who might have ever watched this, they should go dig around. NSU has an herbarium. I don't know what their field book collection is like, but they should go dig around and see how old is your oldest collection. Was it when you were part of Indian Territory? What is the botany of the Cherokee Nation? I mean, you should go check that out. There's a project.
We have more trees on our campus than any other university in Oklahoma.
Absolutely. Thank you for pointing that out. There's this, this is inspiring in so many ways, and certainly there's a lot to learn there. I know Dr. Christine Hallman is leading nature walks, and we have one coming up on March 31st. And so what you mentioned and what I've heard, it's been it's connected for me in that way as well, of how important getting out in nature and all the work of these people, their everyday lived experiences. And I mean, it connects to Civil War, to the cycles of violence in the area, to suffrage movements, as you bring up, and all these different dynamics. It's so powerful. So thank you for your work and sharing it with us through this book talk. And I'm glad we are able to have, these are certainly community building opportunities to have these intellectual exchanges and conversations. And I'll stop the live stream now. And so we're going to stop the live streaming.